The BRICS countries are actively moving away from the dollar, and the dollar is being used less and less around the world. It also means that the US empire, which is built on the US dollar, is falling apart. And if you don't have the money that comes from being the World Bank, Washington loses a lot of money. It's also a Ponzi plan, you know? And the Ponzi scheme can only work if people back it and believe in it. When people figure out that it's all a scam and leave, the whole thing falls apart quickly, just like an empire does when its power is lost. In an old episode of the Jimmy D Show, Max Keiser was on the show, and they talked at length about the fall of the American dollar, which Keiser called one of the biggest Ponzi schemes of the last 50 to 60 years. It was this bold claim that led to a comparison between old-fashioned banking systems and new digital currencies. Keiser talked about how El Salvador was one of the first countries to use Bitcoin and how its bold economic plan was different from the US's more cautious approach. Right now, the price of Bitcoin is $1.62,000, which is a 6.32% rise from last week. Countries like El Salvador are not only investing in Bitcoin as the global supply of the cryptocurrency decreases, but they are also incorporating it into their economies, which could lead other countries to follow suit. Keiser gives us a lot of information about how El Salvador's ongoing dedication to Bitcoin could make it one of the richest countries in the world because it invested a lot of money in cryptocurrency early on. People in the US are upset about things like sending money to Ukraine, but the government makes the money. They're not going to be stopped. It can be printed and sent to Ukraine. As we can see, that money leads to inflation, which causes the middle class to go bankrupt. People are furious and tell the government to stop sending money to Ukraine. But to get to the point, they should be marching against fiat money and for Bitcoin to be used instead, like we do in El Salvador. Of course, you can also enjoy the wonder in El Salvador. The Bitcoin system works in a circle. All of it is in Bitcoin. That is, if you want to, you can use Bitcoin your whole life in El Salvador. Every month and every year, the rate of adoption goes up. You can do it now, though. I know Mike Peterson from Bitcoin Beach. He started the Bitcoin revolution and the cycle economy in elliott, El Salvador, by giving free Bitcoin to everyone in town, including the people who sold pupusas. Their advice was to only deal in Bitcoin, because the surfers who came to elliott brought money from different countries that local businesses couldn't accept because they don't take credit cards and the surfers didn't have bank accounts. It was a pain for these guys to have to walk 20 miles down the road to an ATM to get cash. But on a Bitcoin standard, you can do business with anyone, anywhere, using any currency, as long as you have a Bitcoin. This is because local businesses accept Bitcoin. The deal is instant, and no one can stop them. That freedom has moved from the US to El Salvador, and you can't stop it or limit it. That's what I'm telling them. Heinz Titt should leave the US because it's a waste of time. The US is now at the very back of the line. They are no longer the bright city on the hill. It's a homeless person who is fucked out, hooked to fentanyl, and dying from whatever. You should now leave the US. It's a trash hole. It is called the Banana Republic. In his most recent speech to CPAC, President McKinley talked about inflation in the US and how the country is now making money off of its debt. No one else wants to buy American debt, so the US makes money to pay for it. The US would look at Central America and laugh and say, "Ha ha, you have to buy your own debt, you hold too much money." The president of El Salvador is telling people at CPAC in Washington, D.C., that they are now making money off of their own debt. The US is the only country that can do this, and it has been a world reserve currency since World War II. They cut Iran off quickly, and they put sanctions on Russia and took its funds. They've turned the dollar into a tool, which is bad because it makes these countries want to find an alternative to the dollar. That's what BRICS stands for. Also, that's exactly what they do. In other words, the BRICS countries are moving away from the dollar quickly. Dollar use is falling sharply around the world, and this means that the US empire is falling apart. The US empire is built on the world using the US dollar. And if you don't have the money that comes from being the World Bank, Washington loses a lot of money. It's also a Ponzi plan. Additionally, the Ponzi plan can only work if there are always people who believe in it and back it up. When people figure out that it's all a scam and leave, the whole thing falls apart quickly, just like an empire does when its power is lost. That's where we are now. The last few years of a huge Ponzi plan that's been going on for 50 or 60 years are the US empire and the US dollar empire, and when it falls apart, it will just fall apart in its own place on its own. Everyone will be confused about what happened. It happened so quickly. It will be quick and painful, but they'll make up some reasons. At the southern border, El Salvador is helping the United States in a big way. the southern border is getting out of hand. When they look at El Salvador, they see that fewer and fewer people from El Salvador are going north. This means they really like President Bukele because he's helping them with a big problem at the southern border. Now, they want other countries to do the same thing, to follow Bukele's lead. This would cut down on the number of people crossing the southern border. Second, to answer your question, it is hard. We have to deal with the IMF. That's right, the International Monetary Fund, EIMF. John Perkins wrote about this in his book Confessions of a Hitman. He worked for the IMF and bankers. When a country in Southern or Central America did something that Wall Street bankers didn't like, they would send in the economic hitmen to throw the leader of that country, etc., out of an airplane. And there are many cases of this in history. It's not a question. They do this, and they have done it before. These days, that job is done by the IMF. Its goal is for every country in the world to use the US dollar. Last week, Donald Trump said that he would punish countries that stopped using the dollar. That's why they're so scared. A lot of people are scared that the dollar will lose its status as a world reserve currency. They can't do anything about it. But you should know that President Bukele has pretty much gone head-to-head with the IMF. He is also in the process of leaving the IMF. The economy is growing fast enough without help from the IMF. Thanks a lot. By the way, El Salvador's balance sheet shows that the country has hundreds of millions of dollars, which is almost $1 billion in Bitcoin. They are putting Bitcoin in their savings, which helps them grow without having to deal with all this crazy fiat money. Not only do they use Bitcoin as legal money every day, but the country has also added it to their books. Our Adopting El Salvador Passport program is here to help. Donors are giving us $1 million so that we can get an El Salvador passport in 2 weeks. After that, the money goes into Bitcoin. There is another type of financial architecture going on that supports Bitcoin. The country will not only accept Bitcoin as payment, but it will also become a fully guarded Bitcoin country. This could make it the richest country in the world, since all the other countries will lose their money in the fiat money madness. All of them are throwing. You should know that El Salvador is going to be the next Singapore. In the next 5, 6, or 7 years, this country's GDP will triple. Jim, this is the place to be. The US is a terrible place to live. To be clear, you are welcome to waste your time in that horrible place. But there is only one country in the world where you can be a part of the change, where people are hopeful and building the future, and where you can freely speak your mind and do business. That country is El Salvador. The world only has one country, and